Hi,
Hello.
everyone. Hi, I'm Ann Betts, and I'm here with my business partner and friend Ursula Pottinga, and we are from BEabove Leadership. And we're going to talk today about why a few years ago we started expanding our work into dealing with and certifying coaches in trauma, and what that means to us as coaches, and a little bit about who we work with and who we don't work with.
Yeah.
So that's what we'll do today. And hi, Ursula.
Hi, and it's really specifically relational trauma. We're not talking about war or poverty or other forms of trauma because they are somewhat different. There's different impact both on the human as well as on the brain. So we really are focusing on relational trauma.
And we can talk a little bit about, I'm going to read a definition of kind of what we think about of trauma, what is relational trauma, and then we'll talk about why we decided to focus there. Let me give you just a little bit of kind of what we're working from. In general, trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by events or circumstances and responds with intense fear, horror, and helplessness. Extreme stress overwhelms the person's ability to cope. There is a direct correlation between trauma and physical health conditions such as diabetes, COPD, heart disease, cancer, and high blood pressure. And then relational trauma, one of the differences is that other forms of trauma, this is not always true, but there are forms of trauma, like if you're in a natural disaster or if you're in a car accident, that can be more of like kind of a one-time thing. Like the trauma happens and then it's done, and there is still like a lot to deal with. In relational trauma, it's persistent, and it tends to be persistent and pervasive.
Yes.
And so relational trauma is an after effect of abuse, neglect, and suffering. Those who are betrayed by people they loved, trusted, or relied upon may encounter enormous mental and behavioral health challenges as they attempt to form interpersonal connections and cope with life's many challenges. So in fact, there's a new diagnosis, if you will. We've probably all heard about post-traumatic stress syndrome. In relational trauma and abuse, they now talk about complex post-traumatic stress, CPTSD. And that is because of the persistent and pervasive nature of relational trauma. You don't get away from it. You don't get the chance to recover often.
Yeah.
So.
And it can happen over so many years. It's just like you said, if you're in a natural disaster, it might and hopefully is a one-time event that happens over a couple of days or weeks. But relational trauma, it can be ongoing for years and years and years, and much of it and some of it starts in early childhood, which creates
It can be
really.
in childhood. It can be in childhood and repeated in adult life. It can be only in adult life. You can have a wonderful childhood and still find yourself in a toxic relationship. I think the other thing, and that's part of this definition, Ursula, that I think makes such a difference is those who are betrayed by people they loved, trusted, or relied on. And I think about, it's like we have an agreement that gets broken, or an implied agreement of love and care. And if it's a natural disaster, you can be mad at God, but nobody did it to you.
Yes.
Intentionally, who was supposed to love you. Or even in a war, well, that the other side isn't necessarily they're not betraying you. That's what happens in a war. Now, that is still highly traumatic, highly disruptive to the nervous system. It just has a somewhat different impact.
Yes.
We decided to go with relational trauma because it is the most common form of trauma.
Well, I think it makes perfect sense because we are constantly, all of us, in relationship. Right. From the moment we are born, forever, we are in various forms of relationships. Right. So we encounter other human beings that we want to trust and we want to care for and we want to love and be loved by.
Yeah. And not, this gets passed down generationally. It's learned behavior. Some of it is inherited stress responses, et cetera. And so there's just, if you look at the history of humanity, it is somewhat a history of trauma. And, we're big fans of Gabor Mate's new book, The Myth of Normal. And one of the reasons that we decided to go into it is we just started, it's everywhere. I wouldn't say every single person, but if you think about, I think about the way I used to think about coaching in a very unsophisticated way 20 years ago, Ursula, is it was kind of like, well, there's these normal, healthy people who are, coachable, and then there's these other people and they need therapy. And it's really not like that.
No.
And you can be successful, really doing well in life, and still something can happen and trauma may reemerge, or you may notice a pattern in your relationships, or you may realize that the reason you don't feel as confident at work is you're actually working for someone who's undermining your confidence intentionally.
Yeah.
So I feel it like the whole coaching and therapy is much more of it's my little Venn diagram. Much more of an overlap than I used to.
Yeah, no, I think that that is absolutely true. And going back to your to the description, the direct correlation between trauma and physical health conditions. And we also know that some of these physical health conditions, such as heart disease, diabetes, or whatever it might be, might only show up further down the line, like when people are in their 40s and 50s, and then are often wondering, how come that, I have this challenge, and it could be trauma related.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that famous book by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who talked about the body keeps the score. And it's such a great title. And you think about sometimes what happens with trauma. There are numerous factors for this, including the age at which it happened, the intensity at which it happened, things like that. It doesn't get processed cognitively in cognitive memory. So it goes into the body. So when we talk about the health conditions, this isn't some woo-woo connection. You can map it. And Gabor Mate does a pretty good job, and Bessel van der Kolk as well, in their books, of saying, here is why we tend to see this kind of health problem with a person who has had this kind of treatment in their life.
Yes.
But I want to ask you, Ursula, why wouldn't we just leave this to the therapist? I mean, come on, we're coaches. Like, why do we have to stick our,
our neck out,
as they say, stick our spoon in the pot? Why not just leave it to the therapist?
Well, I pondered this question, as I sort of was walking the dog, going like, what really, why for us? For me, one of the reasons is I think that coaches are uniquely equipped, actually, to deal with trauma and their clients. We are naturally empathetic, we care, we are non-judgmental. It's all part of the coaching mindset. It's exactly the container that a client that has experienced relational trauma needs. And we have this skill set. We are deep listeners. We have tools. We work with emotions. So I think it is in many ways a natural fit for us to include that area of our clients' lives.
So I want to build on what you said a little bit. Sort of one yes and one yes and. So the big yes that I have as well is that sometimes people acknowledging that you've been impacted by maybe family of origin treatment, and that maybe your family wasn't that great, and maybe it has an impact, and maybe you are playing out certain patterns. When you are a successful person who's doing okay in life, that can feel somewhat shaming. And coaches have an ethic of holding their clients creative, resourceful, and whole. And so to be seen this way, as this does not define you, we are not defining you as a victim. You might have been victimized. There's a difference. You might have been taken advantage of or conned or manipulated, but you don't have to be a victim. Yeah. And you can be whole and naturally creative, resourceful, and whole, and still have things that need healing. There's a paradox there. And I think coaches can hold that. The thing I want to say about the skills, and it really is a yes and, because I say, yeah, we have the skills. And one of the things that we have learned in training ourselves and in training coaching in this area is, I believe, and Ursula, help you, if you have a different thought, bring it on. But I believe we have the skills. And if you're going to actually work intentionally in trauma, you actually need additional skills.
Yeah.
You need additional training. And one of the things I looked at before we created this program is let's take a look at what the International Coach Federation says. And they put out a paper on coaching and therapy, and they were very clear in their paper that there were certain things that might be going on with a client that could require therapy, or, and they said this all throughout the white paper, therapy or a specialized coach. And I would agree with that. I think if you're going to work with someone on healing after, maybe a relationship with someone who is high in narcissistic traits and very manipulative and abusive, there's some advanced training that you do need to know in terms of working with that, but we still think you can do it as a coach.
Yeah, and I think that where I sort of was going is that we have the experience, we are equipped already. And so when relational trauma shows up, if we have the additional skill set and the additional tools, and certainly for me, working, with you on this program has really opened my eyes to some of the things that I did as a coach way back when was actually not helpful in terms of having a client that has gone through that. And then I think intuitively, I also did some things that were helpful. The other thing I want to say is, in my experience, clients come to most of us with a certain topic in mind, career change, vision, purpose, whatever it might be. And I have found that when they get stuck and really stuck over long periods of time, there's actually something underneath the surface that they're either not aware of or are aware of and can't talk about it, that actually points to the impact of trauma that has them stuck there.
Absolutely. I have a great example of that. I had a guy come to me, career change. He wanted to move out of one career into another career that was more fulfilling. I did all of my standard stuff and values and what was going to be fulfilling, and he would not move off the dime. And what finally got unpacked, and I was able to see, because I now have a trauma lens that I bring to things, is everything was about pleasing his narcissistic father.
Yes.
And nothing he did was ever going to be good enough to win the approval of this guy. And until that got broken apart, he actually was paralyzed in even trying anything.
Yes.
So that was actually someone that, let me talk a little bit about therapy for a moment. He was someone that I finally got to the point where I could not help him as a coach, because he was unwilling to admit that was what was stopping him.
Yes.
And I think he wanted me to have a little coachy magic wand. And I finally just said, until you deal with your relationship with your dad, I don't think you're going to be able to move forward. Little judgy, but I had tried everything. So I wanted to say one other thing about why we got into this. And then we'll talk a little more about where I just went, like, who do we send to therapy? Who do we work with in coaching? The other reason is that we got into this is, frankly, there aren't enough people who are trained in this, whether they're therapists or coaches. And I had the chance I work with a woman who's quite well known in the narcissistic abuse field, quite famous at this point, and had got to know her before she was as famous. She's a lovely, lovely human being. And she was saying, we need you. There are not enough therapists, and therapists are not trained in relational trauma. She said when she became a therapist, she had like a couple of days on personality disorders. This person believes that narcissistic traits, not a diagnosis, it's a description, high narcissistic traits to the point that they can cause disruption to other people's nervous systems and health, are as high as 20% of the population. Now, they might not fit the definition of narcissistic personality disorder, but they are narcissistic enough that they're causing harm.
Yeah.
She said it could be as many as 1 out of 5. And if you
Whoa.
think 1 out of 5, and there's not enough. So first of all, there's not enough therapists to go around, period. Since COVID, it seems to me they're way too busy. And then she says they're not trained in this.
Yes.
So we felt like we needed to at least come in, help coaches understand this a little better so that we could add to the mental health field.
Yeah.
And also knowing when is it something we can work with and when isn't it?
Yeah.
So
No,
Ursula,
absolutely.
what's your tell on whether to work with someone as a coaching client or to basically say, bless you, let me see if I can find you somebody else to work with who has different qualifications?
Well, I think that you already pointed at one thing, which is willingness. If I have a client that is willing to look and be curious and learn and become more aware and dive into what might be going on, then it is absolutely a client that I can work with. I mean, you said it, if they're absolutely stuck, but they are also too afraid to look at it, then that might be more than I would be able to handle or be willing to work with.
Or it might require a much slower, much more patient process, which is not really, Ursula and I are trained in a model of coaching, which is one of the parts of it is deepen the learning and forward the action. And with this guy, we would deepen the learning and then he wouldn't do anything. So there was no test of it. There was no learning from it. It was just cycling back to the same thing. Now, maybe I could have done just little steps, but the willingness wasn't there.
Yeah.
I think kind of building on the willingness, the other thing, and it's one of the main things that I look for, and I think it's the two are related, is can the client be an observer of what's going on? Or is it so distressing that they go out of what Daniel Siegel calls the window of tolerance? So are they is what they're looking at so hard for their system that they get, panicked, or they can't talk about it, or they shut down, in which case they probably need again, the slower, maybe different process of a therapist. But I think about, clients that I've had who want to make sense of things and they're oddly fascinated. They're like, wow, my whole family revolved around my brother. That's really interesting. I think he was the golden child and I think I was the scapegoat, and I think that's still happening. Wow. Okay, what do I need to do because it's not working for me?
Yeah.
You can even feel the energy of a person like that. Like, oh my gosh, I've got 20 different coaching tools we can work with on that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, talking about the observer mind and the window of tolerance. I have had a client that would get very emotional and tearful and regret and, deep sadness. But again, from this curious place of saying, oh my God, I'm tearing up. It's really sad. I wasn't aware that I would actually be this sad or this mad. And so that's the clay in the hand of the coach that we can work with. And to your point, and I have learned so much in this program, including taking my good old time, because I'm naturally patient. But in this arena, it's like, let it unpeel in its very slow, caring way so that the client really can stay in this window of tolerance and learn from the experience.
And I really love what you're saying. And just because a client is crying does not mean they are out of their window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is just fundamentally, it's like, is the stress so high they can't really think anymore? They can't really process. And, I had a friend who went through a program where he was being acknowledged. And it took him out of just being acknowledged, and having people see him took him out of the window of tolerance. And he called me to tell me, like, hey, how did it go? And I knew that was happening in this program. And he was so choked up, he couldn't even, he's like, I have to talk to you later, because of the way that he was raised. actually having somebody see what was good about him was so distressing to his system, he couldn't stay with it.
With it. Yeah. Yeah.
And what do you do? And he was a friend and not a coaching client, but I think about that. It could, so it's not always necessarily, oh, we're looking at this deep, dark thing. We could be looking at how, talented you are, how much people love you.
Yes.
That can be distressing for clients. This was an example of a person where my feeling is needed some more therapy before coaching was appropriate, because he couldn't even say, wow, I like, more like your client, like, wow, I notice when they were complimenting me that it was a little hard to be with. And I noticed I'm very choked up and I'm even a little teary. That's different than not being able to having to hang up the phone.
Including saying, I'm aware that I really don't want to talk about it. And it's probably the one thing I should be.
The one thing I need to talk about it because, oh my gosh.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And the other thing that I think is also interesting in terms of, having clients right here, right there with us. We know our clients often for long periods of time. So we already have this trusted and loving relationship that is required for this kind of, topic. The other thing is that often also clients get into patterns. So I had one client who would change jobs a lot, but would end up with the same dysfunctional boss 4 times.
And we've also seen this with relationships.
We
you
have
marry
this
the
also
same person,
relationship, the same, boyfriend, the same girlfriend relationship, whatever it is. And so it became, obvious that I had to help her see that pattern, because what you don't want is you don't want your clients to keep repeating something that is clearly not serving them.
I love that. And as a coach, you can have that meta view, and especially if it's a client you've been with a while. And the other piece about that, this is actually what I thought you were going to say. I love the pattern piece, but the other thing that has happened with me is I've had clients where they've been my client for quite a while, and we've worked on business stuff, and it's been helpful, and we've, they've moved forward and, launched a business and different things like that. And then, this has happened to me a couple of times where years in, they've said, I want to talk about something that I haven't felt I could talk about.
Oh yeah.
My relationship with my wife is I think it's abusive. I think I'm, being constantly undermined, or my husband or my partner, or, things like that. And they're finally ready to talk about it because of that trust. So I think that happens as well.
I think this is so valuable, what you're sharing right now. And because what it makes me realize is that it's not only the trust, but we start unpeeling certain things in certain areas that might not be related to this really big thing. But the more the awareness increases in terms of values and mission and, being aware of what it feels like, an embodiment, and all of the tools that we bring, the more the client starts realizing there's something wonky happening over there in that area, that they now want to align with the other areas. And so, I think
like everything's working, but this doesn't work. And when everything wasn't working, I didn't notice that as much.
Exactly, because it was in the same, I know, it was in the same bucket, right? It was all in the same gray bucket. And all of a sudden you have these shiny pieces over there, and there's this one dark space still there that we then want to really integrate and look at. And so it's in many ways a natural progression in terms of coaching to go from there to this other area.
To that. And it doesn't always require, again, depending on where the client is, it doesn't always require referral to a therapist. And I think, there's a subtle difference between, because one of the things we learn in working with relational trauma is, and we've just learned this about human beings, we don't only exist in the present and future. We are our past. There's a whole lot going on in the past, and we can't just ignore that. But it's really a question of how we work with the past. And I think in this, even in trauma coaching, it's much more about how is the past still intruding on their present?
Yes.
And how is the past informing their present? What do they need to do in the present, given that this is maybe what they were patterned for, and we do use neuroscience because we are neuroscience experts. So we talk about how you were wired for love and approval early in your life, because that's going to have a tendency to repeat. But it's not just about understanding that, it is understanding that for the sake of having more freedom and choice in the present and future.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, I love what you're saying, because in coaching, we want to bring things into the present so that the client can move forward into a future. I mean, that really is, learning and forwarding the action. And that's just so important, that we bring what is in the past into the present so that we can look at it and make the future work better.
And make different changes and realize and have more of a realization of, what is that wiring that has us tend to gravitate in certain ways or feel comfortable. For me, one of the things I had to realize was that I was wired from my past to having a certain comfort level with being ignored.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sort of comfortable with, I'm kind of comfortable with that. like, because I've 50 odd years to get used to being treated as if I'm not as important as everyone else in the family or the relationship. And so being able to see that and say, oh, the reason that I chose certain men in my, to marry or be in relationship is because I have the adaptive strategies and the neural pathway comfort level with being treated in a certain way. However, there's a part of me that doesn't like it anymore. I don't like it. I don't want it. I'm becoming less comfortable with it. I'm going to rewire.
Mm-hmm.
But it's understanding, it's not a freaking mystery why we tend to choose the same job, like in your client's thing, or, marry the same person who looks really different at first, but it ends up having the same impact in the long run, because we follow what we're wired for. And if we can pull that apart, then there's more like, I like to say, that saying, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. At first it's like, damn it. But okay, now it's my responsibility to recognize that and not reinforce that, but find a different way. So I think in our next video, is to come in the future soon, we will talk about how do you work with people who are going through trauma, how, big picture. We're not going to do all the nitty gritty details, but we'll look at that in terms of, okay, what's different in that kind of coaching. So stay tuned, come back for another video on that. And I hope this one's been helpful for you today.
Yes, we hope so. And thanks for listening. Thanks and take care.
Thanks, Ursula. Bye-bye.